Hi there, and welcome to Sewing with Mrs. B. We're going to start off with a running stitch, which is sometimes called a basting stitch, although that's more to do with how you use it. So we'll get to that as we go along. But just so you know, when you see the words running stitch, and later on when you see the words basting stitch, they mean the same type of stitch. Okay, now, if this is the first time any of you have ever seen any of this equipment, let's just do a little quick rundown. And I'm not going to apologise to those of you who know what everything is. You're just going to have to be patient. Thank you for your patience. Okay, so I have in front of me the most basic of sewing supplies. I have over here in my pincushion my big sewing needle. This is quite a big darning needle. It's got quite a nice big eye. We call the little hole up there the eye. And it's got quite a long shaft. It's also quite sharp. I've chosen this needle because it's a good size for someone to handle if they haven't used a hand needle before or much. It's a bit easier to hold on to. In my pincushion I also have, oh look, what a surprise, some pins. It's a really great idea to have a pincushion to keep your pins in. Magnetic pincushions are really good too, but the most important thing is to keep your pins from rolling around so they don't end up on the floor. The thread I'm going to be using in these demonstrations is a thicker type of thread that's more often used in embroidery. This is perlé. You can see it's quite thick. I'm also going to use some multi-stranded embroidery thread. So this one has 3 strands. And if you use some of that yourselves, you'll find it's a little trickier to thread. The bonus is that you can see your stitches nice and clearly. So I'm going to leave that over there. I've got a pair of scissors. I only want to say this once about the sewing scissors. Don't use them for anything other than fabrics and threads, please, please. If you cut paper with them, they will go blunt. I guarantee it. So these ones weren't terribly expensive, and to be honest, they're probably not terribly great quality, but they're not too bad. Okay, I also have some little bits of felt, which is what we're all going to be using to start off with. The nice thing about felt is that it doesn't fray. So when you're handling it, as you're learning how to stitch, it won't fall apart in your hands. And that's pretty cool because you'll find you'll go a little bit slower until you get the hang of it. So you need to be able to handle your fabric a lot. I've got a ruler too. That's mostly just so I can show you how long the pieces of thread are that I cut. So that when you ask, Mrs. B, how long does this need to be? I can say, well, about 20 or 30 centimetres, and you can see what I'm working with. Fantastic, we're going to get started. Here's a piece of this thread that I mentioned earlier. So this is cotton perlé thread. It's got a nice thick twist to it, and it's a little bit shiny when you embroider with it, so it looks pretty. Mostly you'll be using regular sewing thread rather than this thicker stuff. So regular sewing thread is a polyester sewing thread that is used for most garment construction and lightweight sewing. But we'll get to thread choices in a later video. So we're going to start off with the end that is going to end up behind our sewing on the wrong side, the bit we don't want people to see. And we're going to start by making a knot. Super simple. For those of you who've been Girl Guides, it's just an overhand knot. So we're going to take one end, we're going to go over, make a little loop, and then pop up and under. And before you just pull the knot anywhere in the thread, wiggle the knot down towards the end of the thread tail so that you've got a little thread tail like that. We do that so that we don't end up with gigantic thread tails on the back of our work, and it's also just a really good thrifty habit to get into. That is, it won't waste too much thread over time. Now sometimes you might find you need to do another knot over the top, and just for good measure I'll do another one over the top. This is a little trickier. So you do the same thing over and under, and then you very carefully wiggle it so that the second knot sits underneath the first one. Do, 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 do. Do, 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 do. It takes a bit of practice to do that, so don't stress if you don't get that right the first time. And for most of the fabrics we'll be working with first up, that's not necessary. Cool. Let's go to the other end. So this is the end at which we're going to attach the needle. Sometimes, if you haven't got a nice clean end on this, you'll need to do something to the end of the thread to make it easier to thread through the eye. And there are a couple of things you can do. You can trim a little bit. So give it a little twist and then just trim a tiny bit so that you've got a nice clean end. Granny's trick, of course, is to lick your fingers a little bit, get it a tiny bit wet, and just make it nice and stiff. Then, hopefully, it should just slide through the end. There we go. Now there is a really cool trick that I've seen on YouTube where a YouTuber will put the thread on their palm and then rub the eye of the needle over. If you can make that work, show me how, please, because I can't make it happen. Okay, now let's just have a look at the way I've got this threaded. So I'm right-handed, so I'm holding this in my right hand, but if you're left-handed, you just reverse it. I've got the knotted end up here, and then I've got, it's about 1/3 of the total length of my thread, and this thread started off at about 30 centimetres. So I've probably got about 7.5 or 8 centimetres folded over there. You don't want this to be too long because then it'll bunch up in your stitches, and we're just working with a single thread at the moment. And you don't want it too short because then your thread will keep falling out of the eye. Right, let's start with this running stitch. Here's my little tiny piece of felt. And there are a couple of different ways you can work a running stitch. We're going to work from right to left. One of the nice things about this stitch is it's not reliant on being worked in a particular direction. What you are trying to do whenever you're working, and working is the verb that I use for most sewing actions, is you want to try to keep your excess thread out of the way, and you want to try to make sure that your stitches are as neat and even as possible. Like any rule, there are some exceptions to that, but let's just start with those two goals in mind, keeping our extra thread out of the way and making our stitches nice and neat. So this is the front and this is the back. Oh, no difference. We're going to start at the back. We're going to go up. Oh, look at that. And then pull the thread all the way to the end. Now don't really yank it, just pull it nice and gently. You can see that the knot has ended up on the back there. And nice and simple, we're going to go down and then come back up. And then come back down. Now, I've had students say to me, Mrs. B, how do you know how long to make these stitches? And the answer is however long you need to make them. This is a fully adjustable stitch that has no single proper length. You need to match it to the length of whatever it is that you're working on, the type of stress the fabric will be under once the thing you're stitching is being used. It depends on what the purpose of your stitch is. Because this is just a sample, if you can make your stitches about 1/2 centimetre long with a gap of about 1/2 centimetre, that's a pretty good ratio. If you're finding this a bit tricky because you haven't done this sort of thing before, just make your stitches a bit bigger. Until you can make them really small and neat, just work on getting a nice even rhythm. Now, if you look at the action that I'm using a kind of stabbing action. So sometimes you might see this type of stitch referred to as a stab stitch, but that's more to do with the action. And you might use a stab stitch to go down where you're working through something really thick. So you need to stab. There's a smoother way to do this, and once you've really got the dexterity and you're familiar with this, you'll find it's much faster. Instead of going down and then back up, down and back up, is to keep the needle lying flat along the surface of your fabric and just under and over. And see, look, you can do a few at the same time. And then pull through. Oh, look at that. Now, basting, that was the word I showed you earlier. Basting is when you use a stitch like this to join together two bits of fabric that you're going to sew together later with a sewing machine. It's a stitch that you use where pins aren't the best solution, or where a pin might get in the way, or when you're stitching together with a sewing machine, something that's very detailed and needs to be very precise. So you need to baste the items together before you sew them on the machine. When you are doing oh golly, I've done that thing that happens sometimes where you make a little loop. Good diversion. I'll come back to basting in a second. So my thread's made a little loop, and when I pull them through, it's made a little tiny knot. This knot is just a slip knot, and you can usually, by teasing it, make it go pop, and out it comes. So don't panic if that happens. It's mostly because the threads have started to twist as your action. So let's just rethread this, and I'll show you one of the best ways to prevent this happening. So let's just pretend you've been sewing, and as you've been sewing, your needle and your thread has been twisting around itself, and you've ended up with a twisty thread that's knotted itself. Hang your work up and just let the needle spin out, and you'll find the thread will untwist itself. Okay, now back to basting stitch, which I've said to you is about joining together, usually temporarily, pieces of fabric that you're going to join later with a sewing machine. When you are doing a basting stitch, the length of the stitch is less important than the precision of where the needle goes to join the two things together that you're going to sew later. So please don't get too worried about the length of these stitches. Certainly when you're using a running stitch as a bit of decoration, it's great to have it nice and even. But for now, if this is the first time you've ever held one of these, don't stress about it. Just get a nice action and see if you can get that needle flat on the surface of your fabric or your work angle going. It's a lot more energy efficient. You'll get a lot more done. There we go. The last thing I'm going to do in this little video is show you how to finish. So we had the knot on the wrong side of our sample before, and we're going to do the finishing knot again on the wrong side. So I'm going to take my last little stitch, pop, and then I'm going to flip my work over. Now sometimes, depending on the kind of sewing you've been doing, there'll be a stitch immediately next to where the thread comes out, but in this case we haven't got one. So we're actually going to take a stitch, and we're going to do it just in the surface of the fabric, very, very lightly scraping. There's enough for the thread to grip onto, but if we turned it round to the front, you can't see the needle. So I haven't gone all the way through. So I've just gone a little bit through, but you know, that's quite firm. So pull that all the way through. Oh, and look, my thread tail, it's got a bit long. Let's make that shorter. So then I've got a loop. Now before you pull the loop tight, I'm going to put the needle through the end once and twice. And going to wriggle that knot down, use my thumbnail to just wriggle it down so it sits nice and flat. And there we go, that's a knot that for most sewing will hold perfectly firmly. Now, if you're sewing something that is under a lot of pressure, you might need to do that again. So I'll just show you that again. I've taken a tiny stitch, made a loop. I'm going to go through the loop twice. Once, twice, and wriggle that down. Beautiful. And take your scissors, and if you've got a long train like this, that's going to get in the way and look messy and potentially make it harder for you to sew the next bit. So I'm just going to snip this, but I'm not going to snip it too short. I'm going to leave about a centimetre and a half. There we go. Fantastic. So that's the running stitch, which has a couple of different ways that it can be executed and can also be used when a pattern or instructions ask you for a basting stitch. Thank you.